Welcome to part 13 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. In this video, we'll introduce a new enemy, the Wisp. This enemy will have unique movement behavior and bring an additional challenge to our dungeon encounters. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's get started and create the Wisp enemy. Now that we have our core logic in place for our spider enemy class, we're going to work on our second enemy type, our Wisp. Our Wisp is going to have a different AI pattern, where it's going to bounce around our screen, and as it collides with objects, it's going to change direction. And so for our Wisp, we'll be relying on our Phaser arcade physics to have our game object bounce around our screen. For this particular enemy, we're going to make it so that this enemy is invulnerable, where our player, once we're able to attack, we won't be able to actually do any damage to that enemy. However, that enemy, if it collides with our player, will take damage. Versus our spider enemy, once we can attack, we're going to have our spider enemy take damage from our player. And so, we'll be introducing a new invulnerable component to keep track of this. To get started, let's create a new class for our Wisp enemy. So under our folder, under game objects, under enemies, let's add a new file. We're going to call this Wisp. Let's go into our spider class. Let's copy our logic from here. We'll paste it into Wisp. Let's remove our logic for our change direction and handle change direction. Let's get rid of our time event, and we'll get rid of our change direction from our component here. Let's update our class name, and so this will be Wisp. We'll update our configuration to also be Wisp config. And so now down in our super call, we'll update our references. We'll have asset keys, we'll have Wisp, and we'll update our ID to be Wisp. And now we want to update our speed, and so if we go in here, let's copy this. We'll do enemy Wisp speed, and for our value here, let's do 50. We'll copy that, we'll come back to our class, and we'll update our reference. And now we need to update our animation configuration. So for this, we want to do our Wisp animation keys. And for our Wisp, we just have our idle animation. And so for our Wisp enemy type, we'll only have one state, and this will be our idle state. So let's remove this logic here. And now we just need to update our preload scene to create our new animation keys. Go over to our preload scene, let's copy this logic here, we'll paste it, and then we'll do Wisp. And since we only have our idle state, let's remove our move state from our state machine here. Alright, so before we add any more code, let's jump over to our game scene, and we're going to create an instance of our Wisp. So if we go up to the top of our class, we'll add in a property to keep track of this. And so we'll have our Wisp. We'll come down here. Let's do this.wisp is equal to a new Wisp instance. For our configuration, let's copy this. I'm going to paste it. Now for our position, we'll do -50. And we'll also want to do collide world bounds, and so we'll copy that. Let's paste, reference Wisp. And now we'll also want to call our update method, and so we'll paste that. Alright, so if we save, we should see our new enemy type show up in our game. Next, for our Wisp enemy, we need to add in our logic to have our game object move around our scene. To do this, we're going to add a brand new state. So if we go into our code, let's go into our state machine under character. Let's make a new file. We're going to call this bounce move state. Let's go into our idle state. I'm going to copy our logic from our idle state, and we'll paste that in our bounce move state. We'll update our class name, so we'll do bounce move state. Now we'll want to add this to our character states, and so we'll have bounce move. Go back to our new class. We'll update our character state name here to be bounce move state. So for this particular state, we don't need to do anything on our onUpdate method, so let's move that logic. Alright, so in our onEnter method, the first thing we'll do is we'll play our animation for our idle animation. For our Wisp enemy, this is just going to be this circle animation here. And now we'll want to update our game object's velocity based on our random direction. So let's remove our code for resetting our game velocity. And first we'll get a reference to our game object speed. So do const, we'll do speed, it'll be equal to this, our game object, and then our speed. Now we want to choose our random direction. And so if we jump over to our spider class real quick, let's copy our logic where we chose our direction. So let's copy our logic where we choose our random direction. Come back to our bounce move state, we'll paste that in. So now when we have our random direction, instead of updating our controls, we're just going to update our velocity on our game object like when we do when our player moves. To do that, we're going to do this. We'll do our game object, and then we'll do set velocity. Alright, so now for our velocity, we're just going to pass in our speed for both our x and y values. And so I'm just going to copy this line of code here. We're going to paste that for each of these. And so if we save, let's come back to our Wisp class. Let's update our state. And so instead of doing our idle state, we're going to go right into our bounce move state. And so we'll set our state here. All right, so now we save. Oh, we have an issue. We need to import Phaser into our file. And so I'm going to copy our import statement here. Let's add that at the top of our bounce move state. Now what should happen is our enemy game object should start moving around our screen. And eventually it should collide with one of our walls and then starts moving just down that wall. So once our game object collides with our wall, we actually want it to bounce off and move in another direction. To do that, we just need to set our bounce property in our game object. So we'll do this.gameObject, we'll do set bounce, and we're going to set it to be 1. And now if we save and we come back to our game, we should now see our enemy will now start bouncing off our walls. Alright, so now we have our base logic working. We just need to update our code for we set our velocity based on our random direction. To do that, we just want to modify our x and y values, and we want to multiply it to be negative to go in the other direction. And so for our first value, if our direction is 0, we're just going to multiply our y value by -1, so it'll move in the other direction. If our value is 1, we'll have both our x and y be positive. If it's 2, we'll have our x value be negative. Then finally, if it's the last one, we'll have both of these be negative, so we move in our other direction. Alright, so we save and refresh. We should see that our game object starts moving diagonally in one of our directions. And in all cases, once it hits our wall, it'll start bouncing around our scene. Nice. Finally, for our Wisp enemy, we're going to add in a simple animation where we're going to have our game object scale up and down, so that way it looks like it's pulsating a little bit. So in our code, what we'll do is let's add a tween. So we're going to do this. We'll do our scene that our game object is tied to. We'll reference tweens. And let's do add. And now for our tween configuration, we want to target this game object. We want to target our scale X property, and we'll do 1.2. And then we'll target our scale Y property, and we'll also do 1.2. We'll want to set yo-yo to be true, so it goes back and forth between 1 and 1.2. We want this to repeat, and so we'll do -1. And now for our duration, let's do 500 milliseconds. Now if we save, we should see now when our game object moves around our screen, it starts growing a little bit and starts pulsating as it moves around. And so if we bump our values up to something higher, we should really see the effect of this. And so now we'll see our game object gets really big and then shrinks back down. And just to keep our code consistent, we're going to move these properties to our configuration file. So we jump over to our config.ts file. I'm going to copy our line of code here for our Wisp. And so we'll do enemy Wisp, and we'll say pulse animation. And so let's do our scale X first. So we'll do scale X. We'll set that equal to be 1.2. We'll copy that, and we'll do our Y value. And now we'll just want to do our duration. And so we're going to paste that line one more time, and we'll just do animation duration. So now we can just copy these values, and so I'm going to go over to our Wisp file. We'll update our properties, and so we'll have our scale X, we'll have our scale Y, and then we'll have our duration. Now that we have our enemy moving around our scene, we want to add in our new component for being invulnerable. So our invulnerable component, this is going to be used by our game objects to know if they're able to take damage currently. For our Wisp enemy, it won't be able to take any damage in our game, but we'll also be able to reuse this for both our spider and our player. So for our spider and our player game objects, we're going to want a small window of time after they take damage where they're going to be invulnerable, and then that way they can't take any additional damage. So a good example is when our player collides with our Wisp or our spider, we'll want our player to take damage, but then we'll want to wait like 500 milliseconds before we allow our player to take any more damage. And so then that way, if they overlap with that game object again, they won't just be losing health consistently. To make this new component, let's go into our code. Let's go under our components folder, under our game objects folder. We'll make a new file. We're going to call this Invulnerable Component. Let's go into our speed component. We're going to copy our logic from here. We'll paste it over here. Let's make our new class name. And so we'll do Invulnerable Component. So now for our properties, we're going to do invulnerable. This will be a Boolean. Let's update our constructor to pass this in. And so we're going to have this have a default value. And so we're going to do false. So now we'll update our properties. So we'll have invulnerable will be equal to our configuration value. We'll update our getter. And so we'll have invulnerable. This will return Boolean. And then we'll reference our property. And now we'll also want to have a setter so we can set this value. So we'll do set invulnerable, get rid of our return. And so for our val, we'll do Boolean. And we'll do this.invulnerable will be equal to our value. And actually we'll just update to be value. One other property we'll add to our component is we'll want to keep track of that duration of how long our game object should be invulnerable for after they take damage. And so for this property, we're going to call this invulnerable after hit animation duration. And so this will be our number. And so we'll want to pass this in through a constructor as well. So let's copy this. We'll paste that in. And so we'll add in a default value of 0. And now let's set that property. And now we'll add a getter for this as well. So I'm going to copy our getter. We'll copy our property name. Let's paste that. And this is going to return a number. And now we can save. So now that we have our new component, we'll want to add this to both our player and our enemies, and so we're going to add this to our base class. So let's open up our character GameObject class. So let's add a new protected. Let's add in our invulnerable component. Now let's create our component instance. So we'll do this, our invulnerable component, equal to our new invulnerable component. We'll pass in our game object, and now we need to pass in our properties for invulnerable and our invulnerable hit animation duration. So up on our config, we're going to make these optional, and so we'll have is invulnerable. And now we want to pass in that duration, and so I'm going to jump over to our component. I'm going to copy our property name. We'll make this optional as well. And we'll have our type be a number. So let's add these two where we're grabbing from our config, and so we'll have our invulnerable after hit animation duration, and then we'll also have our property for is invulnerable. So now we can pass those into our instance, and so we'll pass in is invulnerable, and then is vulnerable animation duration. Now we just need to update our child classes to pass this component information through. Let's start off in our player class. Alright, so now in our player class, we call super. Let's do is invulnerable. We're going to set that to be false. And now we just want to pass in our duration. And so for this, we'll make a new property. We're going to call this player invulnerable after hit duration. Let's add that to our config file. So we'll export const, and we'll set that to be 1000. So if we go back to our player class, let's update our import, and now we'll save. Now we just need to make the same change in our spider and our wisp classes. So if we jump over to spider, let's set is invulnerable to be false on our super call. And so for our spider enemy, we won't provide a delay for after they take damage. For our spider enemies, we want these to be a very weak enemy type, where once we attack them with our sword, we're going to push them back a little bit, and then we want to be able to attack them again right away. And so by not providing a value, we'll default to 0, and that's going to allow our player to keep attacking our enemy over and over again. So now for our wisp class, we want to go down to our super call, and now we're going to add in is invulnerable, but we want this to be set to true. And then that way this enemy won't be able to take damage from our player. And so one quick change we're going to make is in our character GameObject class, when we pass in our properties for our is invulnerable, we're just going to add a default of false here. And so if we don't provide a value, we'll always default back to false. And so by adding this value here, if we ever change our component so we don't have a default value, we'll always provide a value in this case. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.